Hmm. Very good afternoon, good morning, good evening to this and to all of you, depending on which part of the world you're joining from. Very delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure to this next edition of DRI Dialogue. We do this periodically, Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Dialogue, to look at different dimensions of how we can make our infrastructure systems resilient to disaster and climate risk, not just current risk, but also risks emanating from climate change in the future. Before I get on to the program, let me just give you a quick introduction to the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI. CDRI is a global partnership. Currently, it has 27 countries as its members. A very wide variety of countries, ranging from Jamaica to Fiji and from Mongolia to Maldives. There are small island countries, there are landlocked countries, there are emerging economies, there are advanced economies. So you have a whole variety of countries part of this partnership. In addition to that, we've got 7 international organizations: the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the European Union, the UN Development Program, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and the UNDRR's ARISE network. So it's a broad-based partnership working together to look at how countries, irrespective of the stage at which their infrastructure development is. There are some countries where they are filling infrastructure deficits. There are other countries that are in a phase where they need to replace infrastructure. But all of these really need to look at how they make infrastructure systems resilient, because infrastructure is really something that underpins human progress, sustainable development, and prosperity. And we do this by doing a number of things: advancing risk analytics to understand risk to infrastructure systems, risk from infrastructure systems, not just geophysical risk, but also hydrometeorological risk, not just risk as it exists now, but in the future. We also do this by looking at the role of standards and regulation in making our infrastructure systems more resilient to risks. We look at the role of finance in nudging us towards either risk or resilience, and we also look at how we can have a more predictable, robust system of recovery of infrastructure when infrastructure is affected by disasters. So that's a quick overview of what we do. We work across a number of sectors. We've been working in the power sector in coastal areas that are exposed to strong winds, in cyclone or hurricane prone areas. We are looking at the resilience of telecom systems, looking at how we can actually not get completely locked into short-term efficiencies, but also look at long-term resilience and what would it take to do that. For the last 20 months, we know what a critical role digital infrastructure has played in keeping things going while the humanity was dealing with a once-in-a-100-year disaster that the pandemic has been. More or less, the digital infrastructure has served us very well. But this is not something we can take for granted. We really need to make sure that this backbone has all the redundancy, all the resilience that it needs to have to keep things moving across the world. Of course, there are people who are working on the sort of cyber dimensions of risk and resilience, but there is a dimension of looking at the physical climate and disaster risk that CDRI aims to work at. And within the broader context of digital infrastructure, there is the specific infrastructure asset, which is the data centers. There is a lot of work being done on data centers. We have a very eminent panel here today to discuss all of that. What we will discuss specifically today is how we can enhance technical standards to improve the physical resilience of data centers, particularly to disaster and climate risk. So that is a very focused topic, and we hope that what emerges from today's discussion will inform the programming of CDRI as well. So while we organize the disaster resilient infrastructure dialogues, our work is not limited to just convening dialogues. These dialogues inform our programming, the programming of our partners, and so on. So this is the first dialogue on data centers. You are very warmly welcomed to this, and we're very grateful for the partners that have joined us in this conversation. I want to assure you of two things. One is that this will be an ongoing conversation, so there will be a follow-up. And the second thing will be that we will not stop at just talking about it. We will actually launch some concrete initiatives to work on the recommendations, the directions that emerge from today's conversation. With that introduction, I have the proud privilege of inviting a colleague from Government of India, Dr. Rajendra Kumar, to provide his keynote remarks. He is with our Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, which is seized with the matter of ensuring the resilience of all our digital infrastructure. So let's hear his perspectives before we turn over to the panel discussion. Dr. Rajendra Kumar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Very good evening to everyone, all the eminent panelists in this panel, all the participants in the audience. It's my privilege to speak to you on this occasion. As the topic is data centers and how to make them resilient to climate change and disasters. Let me talk about the MATI's initiatives that we have taken to achieve this goal of climate friendly or disaster resilient IT infrastructure. MATI is the domain ministry in Government of India for dealing with the IT domain, the IT industry, the IT infrastructure, digital services. So all these activities are being coordinated by MATI. The program which we have initiated as the umbrella program for the entire digital transformation of the government for all the digital initiatives is the Digital India program, which some of you may be aware was launched about 7 years ago, formally launched in 2015. And over the last several years, it has had many remarkable achievements and successes, which have propelled India to the leadership position today when it comes to the IT domain, both in the IT industry as well as in digital government, in ensuring that the entire digital infrastructure, the digital interface that the government departments have for providing services to citizens and businesses is completely made online and digital. So as a part of this larger Digital India initiative, we have put great focus on creating robust IT infrastructure, and data centers is a key part of that effort. The main program that focused on data centers is named as Meghraj, and that was launched about 7 years ago by MATI as a large-scale initiative to promote the use of cloud as the preferred approach by government departments to ensure that they can avoid duplication in creating the same infrastructure. The infra can be utilized more efficiently, and the applications can be made live quickly. So with these objectives, the program was launched, and over the last several years, we also have done the empanelment of private cloud service providers in addition to the government provider, that is the National Information Center within my own department. So at present, 17 cloud service providers have been impaneled by MeitY. And these range from very large providers which are known worldwide to domestic providers which are not so big. And here the idea behind this process of standardizing the entire approach towards cloud enablement and cloud adoption is to ensure that we formulate common approach, common standards towards both creating the data centers and the cloud infra, and also allow government departments, the users, to avail of that infra in a seamless manner in the fastest way possible. And this has been now done in a very effective manner, as we have almost all the entities that provide the data center and cloud services within India on this platform of MeitY. And this has led over the years to cost reduction. It has ensured scalability. It has reduced the time to implement greatly by government departments, and it has also ensured availability. So as a result, you might have noticed that we have been able to implement very large common platforms as part of the India stack over the years. The latest example of that is the national vaccination platform called CoWIN, which is the world's largest platform for vaccination, completely digital from end to end and completely mobile platform driven. Also, there is a web interface, but mobile is the most preferred access platform for the users. So this is just one example of how this entire efforts by MeitY towards standardizing the cloud platform and doing the entire process of interaction with the industry, bringing them on the common understanding that we have, common approach, has been effective. Similarly, we have other platforms like the Unified Payment Interface, again, a very large national platform for payments, online payments, which has made life easy for everyone, much easier for everyone. We have the digital ID platform. We have the government e-marketplace. We have the goods and services tax platform. So all these are very large national platforms which have come into existence in the last 6 to 7 years, which have really transformed the way that government departments develop and implement applications, digital applications. Now, these form the basic building blocks using which a department can go live within a very short time with this application, because these building blocks are there. Whether I talk about digital identity verification in real time, online, through a completely online method, or you talk about government procurements, or you talk about payments, all of these basic building blocks, the national platforms are available now for just plug and play. So through APIs, any department can integrate with these basic building blocks and launch an application in very quick time. So that's the advantage that we feel has come to the entire ecosystem in India, the digital ecosystem of this approach of having very large scale cloud platform being enabled for launching of applications and creating platforms. There are some other initiatives that I would like to mention here, which through which we again wish to promote the disaster resilient IT infrastructure. These include the cyber security initiatives for MeitY, again a very large initiative, which has really brought us great laurels internationally. This year's in the UN ranking, India has been ranked within top 10 of the countries. India is ranked 10th in the world in terms of the global cybersecurity index out of 180 plus countries. So that's a huge jump from the last year's status of 47. So we have moved from 47 to 10. So that's again a major initiative that we have taken, which is really making India a very safe, trusted, and secure place for doing business, for obtaining services online by anyone. So that's one major initiative. We also have the personal data protection bill at the advanced stage of consideration, which will bring focus on the data collection, data processing, data handling. And we also feel that that will give a huge impetus to creating new IT infra, especially the data center cloud infrastructure, which will again bring back the focus on the approach that we have always propagated, that is to focus on disaster resilient infrastructure, to opt for the most efficient infra so that we can benefit from the efficiency gains, and the departments can benefit from quick turnaround in developing and going live with their applications. We also have the National Data Center Policy in the works and a hyperscale data center scheme, where the focus again is on building infrastructure, IT infrastructure of the most efficient type, which is disaster resilient, and where we focus on standards and building domestic capabilities in these areas. So these are some of the major initiatives that MeitY initiated to ensure that the data center infrastructure and the other parts of the IT infrastructure, they are disaster resilient, and they, at the same time, they can meet the fast growing demands of our user ecosystem, and the fast growing demands of the economy. So let me close at this point of time by wishing all the very best to this event for the celebration that lie ahead. And I would like to assure that in terms of the efforts by MeitY, we are very much aware of this entire approach to making the IT infrastructure a disaster resilient. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajendra Kumar. That was amazing. I'm Emma Fryer. I work for Tech UK in the UK, and we're a digital technology trade association, and I am responsible for leading the data center program. So I'm very, very interested in the resilience of data centers and cloud infrastructure. I just want to thank you very much for that. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic scene setter. I love the emphasis on your coordinated approach and the fact you've got an umbrella platform for this, which I think is critical. Joining the dots is always so critical in these landscapes. The other thing I really liked was your emphasis on not just outcomes, but the timeliness of getting those outcomes in place and building on case studies and building on experience, which I always think is critical. And I think we'll probably talk a bit about that in the panel. And I thought there was, no shortage of ambition, which again, we've got huge problems ahead of us and we need that ambition in order to tackle it. So thank you so much for setting the context in that way. And I think that's given us a great starter for our panel. So I'll be moderating the panel. Those of you online, you may have questions for the panelists. Please don't hesitate, stick your questions in the chat and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can towards the end. What I'd like to do just first is explain the way the panel will be structured. We have 3 panelists, each of whom will make a very short presentation. And then we have discussants who will essentially provide a short observation on that to expand on that particular scene that the panelists have presented in their presentation. I'm just going to tell you who we've got, although you can see some of them already. So we have Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed, who's Vice President, Global Services Delivery at the Uptime Institute. We have Mr. Pradeep Jhunjhunwala, who is Director, Partner Technology for Azure, Microsoft. And we have Mr. Jacques Fluet, Director, Service Assurance and Data Center Program at the TIA, Telecommunications Industry Association. So those are our 3 panelists. In terms of discussants who will essentially provide an observation on what the panelists say, we have Professor Simon Pietro Romano, who's Professor of Computer Networks at the University of Napoli Federico II, is that? Not quite sure, in Naples in Italy. We have Mr. Hiroshi Ota, Secretariat at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, you'll all have heard of that. And then we were to have Mr. Himat Singh Sandhu, who's Digital Development Consultant at the World Bank, but I'm really sorry to say he's had an emergency, so he won't be able to join us for this particular session. So I think Mr. Ota is very kindly agreed to pick up his comment. So I hope that set the scene and explained how we're going to run things. We're kicking off with Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed, and he's going to set the scene in terms of the need for technical standards and the gaps in the existing provision of those standards that we have at the moment, standards for enabling data center resiliency to disasters and other climate change risks. So would you like to take over, Mr. Naveed?
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Naveed Saeed from Uptime Institute. I'm VP of Global Service Management within Uptime Institute, and today I'm gonna share with you a brief introduction about the risks those are posed by climate changes to the data center infrastructure. I believe everybody can see my screen, my presentation now. Am I? My presentation is visible on the audience?
Yes, I can see it.
All right, great, thanks. Just want to confirm before moving on. So climate changes are creating new and severe risks for the data center industry. And these risks are associated with the physical infrastructure of the data centers themselves, as well as the peripheral infrastructure, those are supporting and running data centers. And some of these risks are prolonged dry weathers, which are disaster for data centers that are running on water-based cooling, extreme maximum minimum temperatures. And these are not just the temperature, these are the extended duration of these temperatures as well. Heavy rainfalls, floods, cyclones, melting glaciers, you name it, there are many of these in this list. What we are going to discuss throughout this presentation is the role of data center designers, owners, and operators. They need to look beyond the existing climate data. Those are basis of most of the standards to develop and select infrastructure for data centers. Extreme ambient conditions, I believe 10-15 years ago, it was not evident, but now it is quite evident. Every year we are seeing a record broken in one country or another country. The extreme high or low temperatures are going above and beyond the previous limits. And those are compromising, undermining the existing infrastructure as well as the data centers which are currently under design and planning phases. Drafts, unavailability of water, and especially for the data centers, those are whose cooling is largely depending on water-based evaporative adiabatic cooling. Those data centers, owners, operators need to look into these conditions in their data center areas. Heavy rains are creating local floods, are disrupting infrastructure for power, communication, and logistics. That's paramount for operating in a data center with continuity. Flooding as a consequence of heavy rains or cyclones or melting glaciers is another risk that is posed, and that probably has not been well documented in the historical data that is used for risk assessment in data center facilities. Now, we not only need to look at the risks those are associated with the data centers or the physical location of the data centers, but also the infrastructure that is associated with it, that is required to run it. And those are the power generation plants in those areas, the transmission lines, the grid stations, the communication networks. Those are supporting infrastructure, the water supply lines, the roads infrastructure network, how they will be impacted by these extreme climate conditions and the risk posed by these extreme climate conditions, and how it is going to affect the availability and reliability of the data center. Sustainability is one of the major goal for data center operators, data centers owners to attain more and more sustainability for their data center to get more carbon neutrality, to reduce carbon footprint, and they are looking into the renewables to offset their carbon footprint. Renewables are also impacted by these climate conditions, and it has to be revisited that which renewables and how reliable they are for the data center infrastructure operations. And a fresh assessment is required for the renewables as well. Historically, data center standards are based on historical data published by the organizations such as ASHRAE to base the design conditions for their equipment, such as chillers, cooling plants, generators, and other design calculations are based on this data. For example, Uptime Institute topology standard requires design to be at least based on n is equal to 20 extreme weather conditions stated in ASHRAE Weather Monitoring Office data. Now, with these extreme conditions, with the climate changes, I believe considering above and beyond n is equal to 20 is more realistic. The designers can look at n is equal to 50 years, or they can even go beyond those extreme temperature limits to have measures in place that can allow the data center to keep operating if the high range of temperature goes above the listed temperature, or the lowest temperature range goes below the listed temperatures. And these assessments need to be done by designers, but at the same time, we are looking for organizations such as ASHRAE to develop some kind of extrapolation futuristic data or models to create that can help the designers to depend upon those predictive models of environmental conditions, and they can base their design conditions on that. Risk assessment is site selection. Risk assessment is a well-developed practice in data center domain. Whenever a data center site location is selected to build a data center, certain kind of man-made and natural risks are assessed, and those can include floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, seismic activity, volcanoes, or some man-made risks such as airports, railway lines, gas pipelines are assessed in that. Uptime Institute Operational Sustainability Standards requires comprehensive site risk assessment for natural and man-made risks. Now, since the severity and the nature of these risks are changes due to the climate change, a fresh assessment is required by the data center operators, data center designers, data center owners to look at what risks are valid now, where the scale of risk severity is getting higher, which were lower in previous case, and what risk mitigation strategies are in place. So a fresh look is required here to update the risk assessment logbooks, and see if the sufficient risk mitigation strategies are in place, or what is needed to be done to avoid that. And that is also, again, will be based on a predictive model of environmental conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating, and I was really interested to hear about your ideas about the ASHRAE forecasting, that we might start looking ahead instead of just backwards. I think I understood that correctly. I also thought it was really interesting because I've been asking for us to revisit site locator risk assessments in terms of standards, because we know that flood zones change over time. And so we think those actual flood zones need to be reassessed regularly, not just at the build stage. So really interested in that. Right, so what I would love to hear from is from Professor Simon Pietro Romano, who has very kindly agreed to make an observation on this topic. We've learned about the necessity for resilient standards for data centers. We know the importance of data centers in terms of their critical functions. We also have seen some of the gaps that exist. So Professor Romano, has the international standards community identified similar gaps to the ones we've just seen? And how is that community working to address those?
Thanks a lot. This is a very interesting and tough question indeed. And thanks for the speaker, the previous speaker, for the thoughtful insights. Very, very interesting presentation. From my perspective as a researcher, let's say, I would like to just highlight a couple of crucial points that are related to the fact that today data centers really play a role that is of paramount importance. We were once used to believe that a data center was a dedicated space located in a single place, perhaps, where most of our information and ICT technologies were residing, and we were relying on data centers in order to have our services up and running. At this meeting, we are now discussing a specific facet of, let's say, the overall quality of service of a data center, that is resilience. And I have to say that in terms of standardization, resilience is somehow overlooked in some cases, and there are people who are working in order to somehow fix that. First off, there are a number of different definitions, obviously, for resilience, but basically I would say that the most intuitive and perhaps fascinating one is the definition that states that basically resilience should aim at being, let's say, letting faults become invisible to users. Let's put this in these terms. And obviously this is difficult to catch. And that's also why standard definition organizations have always struggled a bit with that. I have recently studied a very nice report from ENISA, from the European Network and Information Security Agency, that has really discussed exactly this point. They have basically studied the main standards that are around and which deal with information resilience at from a wide perspective, let's say. And they have identified gaps there, and I tend to agree quite a lot with what they stated. First off, they say that resilience should be better specified in terms of metrics, and especially such metrics should, in line of principle, be derived wherever this is possible, obviously, from existing metrics that are used in different for different facets that are basically typically reliability and failure analysis. And this is important because having metrics really matters when we carry out our professional duties. They also somehow stated that there should be a focus specific to resilience inside the standard works, which means that resilience should definitely become a sort of keyword that is used for classifying also standards. And this also calls for a secondary aspect, that is having a taxonomy of what resilience is all about, what it definitely and actually means to all of us. Just to, let's say, recap on all this, there are efforts inside the data center community. I think that you're all aware about this. There is, for example, the infinity paradigm proposal from the International Data Center Authority that is, from my personal perspective, the most complete work about defining the level of resilience of a data center. Why that? I would say this happens because they are looking at the data center with what is called, with one of the, the usual buzzwords, but in this case, this really fits. It's a holistic approach whereby they state that we were used to look at data centers as a single facility located in a single specific site. And this is not true anymore. And we must definitely deal with this. And we must be aware of the fact that the main function of a data center at the very end, the core of its function, is to serve the application layer, the business layer, let's say. And so we really need to have both the macro perspective on a data center that allows us to have a bird's eye view of the performance of the center itself, and that involves and includes a number of different facets. And then we must be also able to somehow drill down with micro views that are dedicated to, for example, monitoring specific aspects that we are interested in properly measuring. So that's why then we need also the metrics that should be defined by the SDO, the standard definition organizations. And there's a lot of work ongoing indeed. I believe that there's just a need for somehow putting things all together in a coherent landscape and in a coherent fashion. And having, just to mention a few, people who work in the ICT arena, like the ITF community, work together with ITU, but also work together with the association from industry, other communities who are much more involved in all of things related to properly managing disasters in a very specific way. So there should be a sort of gluing community that is somehow seeing the light lately, that should really focus exactly on putting pieces together in order to arrive at a coherent look at the problem that is a complex one.
Thank you so much, Professor Romano. So that sets us up nicely, I think. I do love the emphasis on what we need are definitions, metrics, a taxonomy, a way of essentially organizing the activity. Because what I have noticed, I mean, I've been in the data center sector for about 10 years, and I've actually been incredibly impressed with the extent of, you know, the number of standards and the maturity of the standard landscape for data centers. So really it's about being able to organize and coordinate that. So that's really, really helpful. Thank you. I'm now going to move on to our next presenter, and that's Mr. Pradeep Jhunjhunwala, and he's going to talk about the practices adopted by private sector entities. He's going to talk to us about how Microsoft is delivering data center resilience. And also the thing I'm really interested in is some of the challenges that they're encountering. So over to you.
Yeah, very good afternoon, good morning to everybody who's come across the world. So, Emma, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So hi guys, this is Pradeep Jhunjhunwala. I'm the Director for Partner Technology at Microsoft. I work with my set of customers and partners to basically help them move to cloud or Azure. And what we are going to today discuss is basically the challenges what we are facing when we are actually going global and the global scale what we operate at. Before we talk about the challenges, I want to share one important data with you guys, everybody. So this is a bird eye view of the scale at which we operate. Today, Microsoft data centers or Azure is spread across 65 plus regions. We are present in 32 countries with more than 200 data centers across the globe, just offering Azure services and managing more than 4 to 5 million servers today, connecting to have more than 20,000 peering connections and 160 edge sites. So that's the scale of operation we are talking about. And when we talk about this scale, there are different challenges what we see, because the whole idea of the scale is to bring standardization. The whole idea of the scale is to build agility on doing it. Practically in the last couple of years, we are adding a country, we are expanding to a country every quarter. That's the whole idea. And with that scale, we have multiple challenges what we see today in our operations, correct? So let me talk about three basic challenges what we see. One is expansion. If you are adding a country every quarter or having 2 or 3 countries in a year, you need to be really, really fast. You can't really wait for a couple of years to build a data center and then go and make the lights on. That's not possible. You have to do it in a very agile manner. Second is the regulation, and that's super important because every country we go in, there's a separate regulation to encounter, there's a separate policy to encounter, and how can we work with that regulation to make sure that we adhere to that regulation. That's super important when we look into this, correct? So that's what is super, super important when we talk about regulations for that country. The third is the environmental challenge, because as a company, we are committed to have no effect on the environment when we expand. And we actually want to give back to the world on this. So that's the three different challenges what we're facing. How can we really be globally sustainable and give back to the world when we go and expand to different areas? What about how can we handle the regulation, and how can we really expand fast, keeping in mind the regulation and the environmental challenge what we face? So let me talk about regulation first. And this is one of the most important aspect, because when you operate in 32 countries, regulation becomes super, super important. And if you look at Azure today, this is the list of regulation we follow or compliances we have, which is highest across the world, correct, compared to any other hyperscaler. We have more than 90 certification or compliance coverages. And we want to make sure that we are compliant to every standard, what every government wants to realize to follow us, and what every customer wants us to follow. But if I have to really break down the regulation into two areas, or really want to simplify this, there are two portions of regulation which I'm looking at. One is the physical segregation, and other is the data residency. And I really, really believe that data residency is the most important, because we all know that data is the new oil, correct? So every country want to have the data protected in the country. And we also want to follow that up. That's why our endeavor to make sure that data stays in the country, and we give a resilient infrastructure to our customer is super important. Just a minute. Super important. So that's what, just a second. Just give me a second. That's super important. So what we have done is, for every country we go in, we make sure that we at least have 2 regions. So data never goes out in the case of disaster happening in one region also. So in India, we have 3 regions. If you go to any other country, we have multiple regions. The other challenge, what we see, is the physical segregation. And this is really, really, this is something which we think that has to change, because every country we go in, every government want to have their own sovereign cloud, where the government customers has to decide in that cloud, which is physically segregated. And today in the world of software, where I come from, there's nothing called physical segregation. Everything is logical segregation. And because at the end of the day, you are going to merge in the internet, correct? Everybody is going to access things over internet. Every citizen service is going to over internet. You're going to get merged on a common platform called internet. So what's the point of having a physical segregation? For me, if I look at physical segregation, it's like you taking a big piece of target where you have random targets, random dots moving on it, and you need to go and target that from the security point of view, or you have a small piece of target which is fixed, and you can target that easily. So for me, the second is an easier portion, where you can always target a fixed piece. In the software world, you can't really understand where you're running. So that's one physical segregation. But from regulation point of view, the other challenge is when you have to expand so huge, the physical infrastructure becomes big challenging. When you make standards of building those data center, how can you have the right standard adhered in every country? How can you get the right support from every country is super important. For example, when I talk about the power, how can I get multiple source of power coming in, and how can every country allow us to do that? Becomes very important. How the labor laws in the country happens, how the land acquisition happens, that becomes super important for us. So from the regulation point of view, physical segregation, physical laws of the land is still a challenge. Data, we understand, is super important, and we really want to work on data. But that's where we think that we need to work with multiple agencies to make sure they understand how the software-defined data center really works, and how they are more secure, even without a physical segregation. The other important thing what we keep on talking about is the environment, because this is super important, correct? The environment is, we as a company are pledged to basically have a sustainable goal. So if you look at it, correct, what is our sustainability agenda? So we just don't look at carbon reduction, because that's what world is talking about. That's what customers are talking about. But we want to basically learn and adapt, and both separately and even from importantly in close collaboration with customers, industry bodies, everybody. And we just don't want to focus on carbon as a static focus. We're committed to take action on water, waste, protecting ecosystem. We want to mobilize and empower through our operations, our products and services, our employees, through public policies, advocacy, and of course, with customers and all the different regulation bodies. So what we have done, this is our pledge on the environment. We will be carbon neutral by 2030, and will remove all the historical carbon we ever emitted by 2050. We have pledged $1 billion fund to do that. So this is super important for us. But if I look at it, all of the different discussions, what we're talking about, and what Mr. Navid talked about, the climate change and stuff like that, how we are doing it. So let me give you a glimpse of some of the research and some of the work, what we are doing to do it, to achieve that. So I'll talk about a project called Project Natic. This is something what we started 5 years back, where what we did is we basically built a data center in a container. And the whole idea is, can we build a data center which can be powered in 30 days and can run over complete renewable energy? And when I talk about renewable energy, it's just not solar or wind. It's about wind and tide, in the tide energy and the wave energies. How can we do that? So what we did is we built this, the whole thing, and we submerged this container inside the sea. So let me show you a couple of glimpses of the pictures what we did. So this is a container going to inside to a ship, and this will get basically submerged inside the sea, and it will stay there for 5 years. And we actually studied what is the outcome of that. So this is some of the pictures of how we did that. Today, this got submerged and this is out, and we have a second phase of this working on it, Project Natic. So this we operated for 5 years, and we had some really interesting observation. And what we wanted to do from this project was basically a couple of things. One is, how can we really have a light out operation? How can we really make the whole data center more reliable? And how can we have a real positive effect on the environment? So people in the data center resiliency world, people is a big challenge. And if you look at all the recent events which has happened, most of the downtime has happened because of some lack of the way people operated the data center. The other challenge, what Mr. Navi said, the climate, correct? Is a big challenge. The change in temperature, the change in the condition outside. The data center equipments are not geared to do that. The third challenge we see is oxidation and moisture. And with every change in weather, this changes. And the data center equipment really don't like that. But when we actually look at the environment, which we submerge in the subsea, what we saw, and we actually had a real light out operation for 5 years, we are able to achieve much more resilient data center. The failure rate of equipment was 1/8 compared to something which was running on premise in a similar on-premise environment, because there was a consistent cooling. We didn't actually had oxygen and moisture. We actually used nitrogen in our atmosphere, so there was reduced corrosion, and there was no external effect of gases for another component. So these are the type of work what Microsoft is doing today to make sure that we build new standards. And what we have done with that is we have actually gone and open sourced this whole platform for other people to use it. So we're building new standards. We have open source. We are doing the whole experiment open source so that people can build on this and build more resilient data center, which is much more environmental friendly and can really reside near to the users. Because there's one interesting fact we don't realize is 50% of Earth, a human population, lives near the source. And we can have this small data center, modular data centers near to every operation. So it provides better resiliency, better latency, better user experience. This is not to replace the large data center we are building. And for those, we are building new technologies which can provide better resiliency, better environmental control, stuff like that. But this is an example of the work, what we are doing to make sure that we reduce the effect of climate, which is effect on climate, which is happening because of the data center, and how can we build better resilient data centers. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Jhunjhunwala. That was amazing, and certainly those challenges were very well articulated. Expansion, rapid expansion, another country every quarter. That's astonishing. I can imagine why that's presenting challenges. Regulation, and I did love your page of regulations. I can imagine that's not the end of them either. And then obviously environment in terms of challenges. We don't have Mr. Himat today, so I'm going to invite Mr. Ota to respond, but I'll just pose a question here, which perhaps you can think about. So we've seen these challenges, and we've heard how private sector companies are applying standards to deliver business continuity in lots of different physical environments in lots of different countries. So having operations all over the world means having to deal with all those different challenges. how can policy and regulation and actually standards development support that so that we can accommodate these variable risk types from country to country? I don't know if Mr. Ota, would you like to comment? It's very kind of you to step in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Thank you, Emma, for assigning me. And first, I think in general, private sectors are using standards quite extensively. So I think in many cases, it is the case that a private sector uses or applies standards as necessary. And the thing is, in many cases, standards are not rules that you must follow, but in many cases, standards are so-called toolbox that you can pick up and use according to your need. So I think it's generally the case. And for the regional variations, I think as presented just now, there are so many standards organizations there, and some of them are regional standards, while there are many global standards. And the regional standards could be tuned for the regional needs. That's, I think, is also important, plays an important role to meet the need specific to some regions. And still, I think it's important to be consistent between global standards and regional standards. But for the regionally specific need, I think regional standards will do a lot of work. And as you shown in the previous presentation, there are quite a few regional organizations making standards. So I think that will be very useful, and that will be maybe becomes more important for considering the variations of the different needs from the regions. And finally, the policy regulators' support for international standards development. I think there are several ways. And for example, of ITU is developing standards in various technology or policy or economic area, and both for wired telecommunication and wireless telecommunications. And the unique characteristics of ITU is that governments, companies from private sector, and research institutions, we call it academia, get together and work together to develop standards. So first option for governments is that they can participate directly to convey their proposal. But looking at the previous presentation, you saw so many standards organizations. So government itself may not be able to participate so many standards meetings. But I guess that in a country, there are many companies that participate in a specific standards meetings. So the government could communicate with the companies that participate in specific standards organizations that develops standards in their interest. Then governments can convey their message or their proposal through the participating companies or participating research institution to that companies. That's also, this would be a bit indirect, but still I think this is a way to encourage development of international standards. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Hiroshi. Yes, so that sounds like we need, everything came out with C's for me. We need more consistency, so we need regional and international consistency. That needs to be achieved through collaboration and through communication between those people who are already doing the work so that governments can actually coordinate. That's a lot of C's, isn't it? But anyway, I think I'm getting the picture. So that's really helpful. But it's really all about everybody talking to each other and joining the dots in simple terms, I feel. Right, I think we're ready to move on to our third panelist, Mr. Jacques Fluet. He's going to give an overview of existing standards initiatives, policies and governance measures for fostering data center resiliency against disaster and climate change risks. So over to you, Mr. Fluet.
Thank you. So you should be seeing my screen now.
I can see it, yes.
Good. So thank you for the opportunity. And let's start. So there's a lot. I work for TIA, which is a standard development organization, okay, one of the many that are addressing data centers. Data centers have a lot of standards that they have to meet and a lot of regulations, as we've seen before, because a data center covers many, many aspects, from the basic infrastructure to all the safety, security, local regulations, fire protections. There's tons of regulations and standards that they have to follow. But here we're focusing a lot more on the infrastructure itself and the impact of disaster and climate change. So when we look at it from that particular aspect, it's all about the building infrastructure resiliency. So the architecture of the building, the power and cooling systems, the telecommunications, the security, the safety, the data center operations, the energy efficiency, the sustainability. So we have multiple standards around the world that cover all of those aspects. In Europe, in the United States, a lot of these software development organizations are looking at that and evolving those standards as the technology evolves. There's two big focus areas related to climate and disaster risks that are impact the data center. The first one is really the proactive version to say, hey, let's reduce the amount of carbon footprint of the data center. So as we've seen from the presentation from our colleagues from Microsoft, there's a lot of big initiatives, especially with the bigger data center companies, but it's propagating right now to all of them, to reduce the carbon emission and to reduce their impact on the scarce resources as well, like water, for example, in certain regions of the world. The other part is more reactive, but it's extremely important in the short term, is the resiliency of the data center. How can you react to events that are happening around inside the data center and around the data center? So let's look at it from the data center resiliency against the climate and disaster risk. There's a location and the architecture that are important. As you see here, I've listed a list of all the things that could happen from the nature. There's a lot of things going on. You know, I'm presently based in the United States, and we've seen pretty much everything in there in the last year. So all of those things happen all the time. So you have to be prepared for it, and you have to anticipate it and be able to react when those things happen. Okay, there's a lot of redundancy in data centers. That's really the basic fundamental, I would say, resiliency concept that we have in most of the data centers. So having two sources for power, water, and connectivity, or even more than two, if possible. Having all the subsystems, having extra capacity in case there's a failure somewhere in the electrical and the cooling and telecom systems within the data centers, and all the computing and the storage as well. Okay, and on top of all of those things, you know, there's pretty much every data center has a disaster recovery scheme. Okay, with backup of data and backup of the application somewhere. There's a lot of standards looking at specifying those things, and it's basically very much used all over the world when the designers are designing new data centers. But the data centers are evolving. They're evolving all the time with the new technology, with the new needs from the industry. So there's the new set of services requirements that are coming. We're looking at having things with guaranteed minimum performance. We know the SLAs are getting more and more above just availability of the servers capacity in the data centers, but they're going to get into performance as well of the services. Lots of new services with very high performance requirements are coming. We keep on hearing about 5G and all those new services that are coming. Well, they are coming, and it will have an impact on all the infrastructure there, including the data centers. We're seeing also a data center infrastructure evolution, distributed computing, having not only the core data center, the regional data center, edge data center, and even the premises equipment as well. That will be all part of a continuum of the storage and the compute for all the services. More and more detailed monitoring. We're seeing also a lot of more requirements in the standards for having all kinds of new monitoring to make sure that we can monitor everything that's going on. We've seen from the presentation from Microsoft when they're starting to put their experience with the data center under the ocean. You don't have anybody there. Everything has to be able to be remotely monitored and remotely controlled. So you have to have very detailed information about what's going on down there. Remote operation is becoming more and more important. As we're distributing the computing, we cannot have somebody watching the systems all the time locally. So we have to be able to do remote operation. And as we're multiplying the number of sites, the equipment that we have, automation is becoming also another big area for standards to look into, on how do we implement all of that and how all the systems are talking to one another. We're moving from having risk avoidance, which was I would say the initial concept around data center. Let's put it in a safe place, to now let's put it where it needs to be put, and do risk mitigation on that part, which links to what my colleague from Uptime Institute was mentioning. But great evaluation of the risk and make sure you mitigate all the risks. The next big evolution, and that's what's coming right now, we're starting to hear about it a lot. A lot of groups are working on it in the various software development organizations. I would say it's the big evolution in the resiliency. Okay, we're starting to work and live in a digital world where everything is pretty much software defined and delivered through software. What we're seeing there is there's a big push about additional level of automation, but also autonomy. We're talking about digital twins. Okay, a virtual model of a data center that is fully connected to the physical world, becoming more and more autonomous in decision making and implementation using artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's a lot of groups working on it. All the people that have DSIMs today, the data center infrastructure managers, are looking into migrating these things into digital twins. Open API, open interface between all the systems. We need to have a lot more standard interface between all the subsystems, but not only the subsystems, but also with the external world, to make sure that we get all the information required to make the best decision. Real-time orchestration is something that is coming in the telecom world, and it's propagating into the data center as well. Being able to reconfigure the data centers and the workloads of the data centers at will when an event occurs, or when just the demand is increasing, depending on what's happening in the society. And the distributed resiliency is also a concept that is happening more and more, especially when you're starting to look at moving the computing and the closer to the users in smaller sites. How can we have resiliency across data centers, across sites, rather than having it only building a very resilient site having it a very resilient network of sites. So that's another concept that is coming that is not currently that well defined in standards, and I know that many standards organizations are looking at it seriously. The next, another big step also is what I call the integrated resiliency. You know, having you cannot be more resilient than the weakest component in your system. So at the end, you have to have to be fully resilient and improve the resilience and I would say the resiliency against disaster. You've got to have a very good coordination between the utility providers, the application providers, the data centers themselves, the network providers, even the weather, knowing in advance what's coming your way. You know, many of the big weather events, you have a few days or a few hours notice that they're coming, and local authorities as well. You know, local disaster alert systems if something is happening locally. So one of the big thing is also looking at all of this is really migrating the data center as part of the overall ecosystem of this new digital world and being moving towards an integrated climate and disaster resilience. That's the next frontier, I would say, that we're starting to look, and a lot of the members of the industry that we are working with are starting to look at that and say, how can we become more integrated all together to deliver, to keep on having the service at all times. And as our digital environment is becoming more and more important in our life, it's gonna be a very, very big necessity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was fascinating. I'm thinking, right, integrated resiliency. It sounds like a double-edged sword to some extent, because, as you said, we all depend on whatever the weakest link is in that chain. But what came over clearly is that we cannot avoid climate change risks. We've got to identify them, evaluate them, and then manage them. So I'm now going to pose a question again. I'm sorry to Mr. Hiroshi Ota, who's kindly doing double shift on these. So we can't avoid those risks. We've got to manage the risks we have. How do we actually deal with that balance between risk mitigation and risk avoidance in terms of standards? And also, as I said, I'm really interested in the integrated resiliency point. How can we mitigate or avoid or manage risks that are actually outside our control? You know, data centers depend on communications, they depend on power, they depend certainly to some extent on transport and on water as well. How do we deal with those intersectoral interdependencies? So over to you, Hiroshi.
Thank you, Emma. And there are several aspects. And first, I'd like to talk about climate change. And actually, ITU-T, which is a telecommunication sector of ITU, various standards in the different areas. And the ITU-T Study 5 is working on climate change and environment. And they are developing several standards to identify, for example, for climate change assessment methodologies. That means how to evaluate the impact of the impact against the environment. And also they developed several standards to manage our behavior or the impact to the climate, such as the energy efficiency or smart energy, and also they are working on the so-called green data centers, which consumes less energy compared to the past previous generation ones, and also how to adapt to climate change. Another aspect from the work of ITU is risk mitigation and risk avoidance. And in many cases, we put 3 phases according to one disaster. Before the disaster, which means how to prepare for the disaster, and during the disaster, how to respond, and then after the disaster, how we can recover as quick as possible. And one work in ITU is for early warning against tsunami. I saw some words about early warning in the chat window, and there's a joint task force between ITU, WMO, and UNESCO for working so-called smart cables, which is a submarine cable equipped with scientific sensors to detect earthquake or sign of tsunami. And this would serve for the early warning so that people on land knows that the tsunami is coming beforehand so that they can gain some time to evacuate. And this may not be so direct for the data centers, but I think still it will be useful for people working in data center to evacuate if necessary. If they know tsunami is coming in half an hour or in an hour, and that time is very critical for people to save their lives. And another aspect for the resiliency is from telecommunication networks, because ITU is working for telecom. So the telecommunication network itself has their own redundancy to prepare for disaster and protect communication in case of part of the network fails, but still the communication can go on even during the disaster due to the redundancy. And as Mr. Fluid indicated, integrated redundancy is very important because data center relies on many things. And telecommunication is one of them, but the data center cannot control telecom, but they need to know how telecom behaves in case of the disaster, so that they can prepare themselves from the data center viewpoint. Another work is from ITU is the study group 2, which leads the emergency communications, and they developed several standards mainly for response during disaster. For example, they developed standards how the people to support or rescue activity needs to be can be coordinated during a disaster. Or another group, study group 15, which works on the telecommunication infrastructure, develops standards on the so-called temporary telecommunication resource unit for initial recovery, so that for damaged area, telecom capability may be lost totally, but by carrying some of the equipment to build up a temporary telecommunication, data center could continue their function to some extent. And as Mr. Fouet mentioned at the end, data center relies on many things, so it needs to be work as a coordinator so that integrated resiliency can be realized. And for example, water or electricity, telecommunication, these are not under their responsibility, but they need to know how reliable or how they can rely in case of disaster. And finally, for the intersectoral interdependencies, First, I think standards organizations tries to divide their responsibility as clear as possible so that they can work independently from other organizations. And I still believe that that makes their work easier. But still, they need to know each other, what other sectors, other organizations are doing, so that they can develop consistent or more synergetic standards to cope with the disasters. And to do that, standards organizations, including ITU, do communications regularly by exchanging documents, or we call it liaison statements, to exchange information, to share the development of specific standards. And I also believe that having joint events, like joint workshop or joint meetings time to time, could be helpful. And another thing is we call it dual participation. Some experts, for example, participating in ITU, participates also in another organization to make the communications between these organizations easier. And I believe this is one of the most powerful methods for coordinating organizations, because it's, if a person participates in person to another organization, it's very easy to convey the message from their own organizations rather than just sending a letter. Sending a letter can convey a lot of information, but the participating in person and convey by talking with the people in that organization could also be a very powerful way of communication. Okay, thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Hiroshi. Wow, I think that's it. What's interesting to me from that is when you mentioned the fact that we need to divide this into prepare, respond, recover. And you mentioned some standards that were covering the response and recovery. But I'm not nearly as aware of standards in that, in those areas. Do you think there's perhaps, are we balanced? Are we concentrating too much on developing these sort of monolithic facilities that shouldn't ever go wrong, and then we haven't anything to fall back on? Or do you think there's a very active area in terms of that the respond and recovery side of things? So I'm interested in just, I'll put that out a little bit later, but I'm really interested in that coming up. Also, I'm quite interested in whether we are looking at the whole landscape and making sure, there's some very busy areas of standards development that I see within the data center landscape in things like design and operation. And then there's other areas where the standards, there aren't so many standards. So I'm interested then to revisit in a bit that issue of potential duplication. So we may have gaps and duplication, or we may just have gaps. I'm not quite sure. I'm just planting the question. But anyway, that brings us to the end of our formal part, and now we're into the sort of open Q&A. And I see there's quite a few questions coming in. So I think we will perhaps pick off a couple of the specific ones. I've also noticed that very kindly, a lot of you have been answering questions busily in the Q&A, which means they've been dealt with, so that's fantastic. I thought one of the ones that I thought was interesting, there were two specific ones about specific risks. One was about seismic risks, mitigation and resiliency, and the other one was about flooding, pluvial, fluvial and coastal. What are we doing there in terms of standards? So I'll put those two out together, although you don't feel good to answer both of them, and open that to the floor. Would anyone like to comment on specific areas there? Thank you, Mr. Ota.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fryer. Ms. Fryer. Sorry. From a telecommunication point of view, seismic risk from earthquake is of course taken into account, and usually the telecommunication network tries to keep the communication running even under earthquake or other disaster. And the typical way is to have redundancy. Most simple way is to put 2 lines instead of 1, so that the one you can continue communication even one fails. But there are more sophisticated resiliency is also studied and standardized to, for example, to share spare resource with many working communication, so that the spare resource can be shared. That means the more efficient redundancy can be realized, because if you put 2 lines and use only 1, it's 50%. But if you share spare resource with between several working communications, then you can achieve much more than 50% of the efficiency. That's one way. And also for the against earthquake, for example, one telephone office may fail. So usually telecommunication network put geographic redundancy, so that in case one area is damaged, but the other area can cover the communication load of that area. That's another way. And I think there are quite a few standards to respond or prepare for the disaster. But as Ms. Fryer said, recovery phase may not be standardized so well. And I'm not aware of many standards for the recovery phase. But I guess this is because that to recovery can depend on heavily on the situation of each case. But having a redundancy in telecommunication network is common and can be standardized easily. But the recovery is maybe case by case. I think that's one of the reasons that the recovery phase is not so well standardized. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that before I move to the next question?
Yes. Let me add a bit on this. So, see, when you design the enterprise systems, which are running on the large data centers, there's one thing which is called standards and one thing which is called the enterprise design itself. And what we talk to customers when we do that is, we have built data centers on standards which are resilient. But if you don't design your systems to adhere to that enterprise standards, to also build your applications which follow the standards, the baseline data centers or telecom network will not solve for it. And today, that's the bigger challenge of what we see in most of the customers. The standards are there. People have those standards placed. When we build the data centers, like having 2 data centers in every country, so that we can take care of the seismic zone and we can take care of the earthquake is there. But then how many customers really want to have a disaster recovery setup done? So when something happens, this can be taken care of. So this is an amalgamation of standards plus the way you are designing your enterprise systems to take care of it. It can't be just a standard working on it. The customers or people who are using the system has to design the systems also based on that. So industry body need to come up and have the standards. But then after that, the customer need to really realize the importance of that and build the systems on top of it to use those standards. That's what I would like to add, because that's super important. It can't be just standards taking all the way.
Emma, if I can just add a minor comment on top of that, it's not just about standardization, but it's more about business. I think that you all know that there are already in the market companies that are selling, let's say, seismic compliant data center solutions. I recall that there was, back in 2019, there was Ranging Wire who was proposing install in Santa Clara, I believe, a brand new data center that was capable of resisting to very strong earthquakes. But basically the standards there come from the construction community. So it's about buildings and about protecting stuff that needs to survive vibrations. So things, again, should be put all together, but obviously the standardization bodies typically include a few sentences about what you can do in case of installment of a data center in a seismic area. And this should become a bit more, let's say, organized in structure, but they obviously think about this. Business-wise, people are already doing business with this stuff.
No, agreed. And if you build a data center in a seismic zone, you have to buy all the components that are rated for this type of zone, and that the building has to be engineered accordingly. And many times there's local regulations about that. But there's also all the rest of the components, like the racks. You have to put some slack in the cabling to support the movement, and all of those kind of things have to be designed accordingly. So
it's exactly that, Jacques. And by the way, it's not by chance that NTT Data was very much interested in fostering these solutions, just because of the fact that basically Japan is one of the most seismic areas over the world, and Napoli itself, the town where I live, is one such area. So we do know what this means, and it's complicated, but obviously now technology is capable of allowing you to design data centers that can be really deployed also in such areas. So you do not necessarily need to skip them.
Thank you very much. Hopefully that's answered that question very solidly. I just wanted to pick up something that Pradeep, you said about this relationship between, you've got the standards, but you've also got to meet customer expectations. And I thought that was interesting because of the fact that we have, and I know this has come up in another question, so I'm trying to pick this up as well, the role of proprietary standards. And obviously Uptime has its own set of proprietary standards, and the relationship between proprietary standards and international sort of peer-reviewed standards, and how proprietary standards can be used in this landscape as well. Mohammed Naveed, would you like to comment on that, do you think?
So the approach, we have to be very careful here, because there are certain standards and then there are certain authorities that have jurisdiction in certain territories. The standards are volunteer. Okay, the data center owners, operators, builders can choose to adopt a standard as it suits its business continuity, as it suits its business requirements. But the authorities, those have the jurisdiction in those areas, those are the regulations, those are the laws, those are required to be implemented. So Uptime Institute standard does not interfere with any authority that has a jurisdiction in that particular area. And that because the Uptime Tier standard and Uptime Operational Sustainability standard is a performance-based standard, it's a non-prescriptive standard. So it allows the designers and the developers to adopt a design that can comply with the authorities. Those have the jurisdiction in certain domains like civil defense, seismic regulations, or certain other emission regulations, as well as long as the performance of the data center can be met with the Uptime Institute standards, the data center can be certified to that particular standard.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? It's just an interesting, to me, it's a very interesting, it's an interesting landscape in which many things are working together in the same direction. So I'm intrigued by that. If not, I just also wanted to touch on, you touched on performance standards as opposed to more prescriptive ones. Do you think they are a good route to delivering resilience because of the nature of a performance-based standard? Would anybody like to comment on the role of performance-based standards? Okay. Shall I start with Hiroshi? Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I think it's very, very important, and performance-based standards guarantees the minimum performance you can expect from each element. And as an integrator of a data center, you need to know the performance or reliability of each element, like a telecommunication network or electricity, water, and other things. Maybe the strength of the building and so on. And to integrate, you need to know how reliable, to what extent reliable of each extent. So I think performance-based standards shows you these specifications. So I believe it is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got just under.
I think
Sorry?
Mr. Pradeep want to add something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please come in.
Yeah, so see, performance-based standard in the commercial industry, correct, actually has a very different dimension. Well, to give you an example, we offer financially backed SLAs for every service we offer from our data centers. So we need to know every component as what is the performance it will give you, because everything is linked to a performance financial implication. So this is super critical when you're building a data center. Until you know the performance of the building plus every component, you can't give that SLA which is financially backed. And that's what the customers are looking for today, because that says that you're really interested in running the business much more securely and much more productive manner. So I think more than anything, performance-based standard is super, super critical when you're building a data center.
Thank you. Sorry, right. And I'll look more carefully next time. We've got about 10 minutes left, just under 10 minutes left. And I had a couple of things I'd quite like to just pull together at the end and pick either of these two questions. I'm going to throw them out. They're quite generic. Firstly, it's clear from this discussion we've had that technical standards are critical for improving data center and broader digital infrastructure resilience to disasters and climate change risks. How can we collectively raise awareness of the importance of resilient standards, bearing in mind this is, I think, International Standards Day today? And then I wondered as well whether we could just do a round panel, just a quick summary of perhaps the top couple of challenges you think are ahead of us in achieving that. So how can we build awareness, and what do you think the challenges are in us adopting and deploying standards in the best way possible to deliver resilience? So I don't know where we'd like to start, but if any of you would like to kick off, then please feel free.
I can start. I think standards are one of the key advantage of the standard is that it gives a basis for the discussion between the data center users, the regulators, and the data center owners. Okay, it provides a basis so you don't have to go back into every single details. You say, do you meet a certain standard or not? And then add whatever requirements you want on top of that, or modify one or two of the requirements of the standard if it fits better for your business or your environment. So it's a very good point to start, instead of starting with, say, hey, I have those 500 requirements. You know, start with the standard and just work with a handful of requirements on top of that. That's a very good start. Also, the standards are evolving. Most of the standards are developed by industry members. So they're developed by the industry for the industry. So at the end, it's hopefully, if we keep on evolving them correctly, they should be pretty much following how the requirements are evolving as well. Okay, and I think that's going to be that's what's very important about having a good standard to start from. And as it was mentioned, you know, standards are voluntary. It's got to have, the people have to agree to follow it. But it also saves a lot of energy to everybody. It saves, everybody knows what to expect. And as we're getting more and more into interconnectivity, it would help to interconnect everything. So I think that's the key point here, I think, for me.
Yeah, I would like to add here that we should not think of standard as a silver bullet for every problem, that can resolve every issue in there. Looking into a data center, probably if not thousands, hundreds of standards are in place working with the data center, starting from the soil survey to the civil construction, to the seismic requirements for that particular zone, to the selecting engine generators for fuel supply systems, the color coding of the fuel systems, everything, it has own standards. Those are in industry, in practice, and there is no one single standard that can encompass or duplicate or list all those requirements into one. So the standards are built over each other, and they're built in a way that all the standards which are required to be implemented and all the authorities regulations can be incorporated while achieving the same outcome, performance-based outcome that is expected from a facility or a cluster of facilities. And this is how the standard should be looked at. Also, standards are for the minimum performance. So there can be better performance. For example, a tier 3 data center is expected to have continued operation 365/7 throughout the life of the data centers for any planned maintenance activity, right? But however, this doesn't allow to remove designers and the data center developers to remove single point of failures from a tier 3 facility. So they can make enhancement in their design. They can put other enhancements which are not required by the standard, but they can be required by the business. So this is how the standard should be looked into.
Emma, let me chime in on this discussion, and especially the comments from Jacques at the beginning were very much interesting for me, since I'm not from the industry, I'm from the academia, and I have to agree on the fact that as Jacques was saying, typically standards are industry-led, which is quite expected, quite normal, but nonetheless, I tend to believe, and for my entire professional life, I've struggled towards that. The academia should contribute more to standards. Personally, I'm very much involved, since I'm a computer networking guy, I'm involved in the Internet Engineering Task Force, just to give you an idea. And I do know that inside that community, which by the way is the community that designs and engineers the internet. So every professor who cares about computer networks should be part of that community, but actually we are very few professors inside that community. And the reason why this happens is that if you write a standard, this counts 0 for your career. If you write a paper, this counts quite a lot. So obviously it's a matter, of incentives. And since I was just culturally brought to contributing, I really didn't care about the fact that an RFC counted less than a paper, but this does not happen to everybody, and I can understand that. So it's a matter of involving people from different backgrounds, because if you have heterogeneous participants, you have better results. Obviously, the industry has to lead this, because we're talking about engineering stuff and not just about making blue sky and open sky research, but this is important. In terms of letting people understand that standardization does matter, we need to evangelize, and things that we are doing today here are exactly about that. We need to talk to people, to let people understand that adhering to standards is not just to get, the label that states that you are ISO compliant or something like that. It's that you have understood the fact that culturally speaking, this is important in terms of adherence to a set of requirements and also in terms of interoperability. So this is fundamental from my side. And just to complete, the second part of your question is a very interesting one. I would say that if we look at the future, for the future, what is required is, let's say, a careful planning and an increased development of both infrastructure and human capital. I read through the questions here that rightfully one of our participants is saying that the part that is important is also procedures about how you should behave during an event. And this is an investment in human capital and in education as usual. And again, I say it's an investment, it's not a cost at all. We should look at these resources as investments and not just as costs for our companies and organizations, because they pay in the end. If you invest in this, then you can really make economies. And
thank you. We've got about a minute left, so I'm going to, if Pradeep and Hiroshi, would you like to come in just finally? Thank you.
So from the industry point of view, if I take the industry point of view, and personally, if I look at it, for me, standards fall into two different buckets. One is, this is a bare minimum you need to do to convince your customer that we follow the best practices across the globe. But the bigger picture on standards is, how can you let your learning out and open source that learning so that others can better that? Today, if you look at the size at which we operate, the amount of standardization we have done in our data centers and we have open source that really changes the way people are building their own other data centers. And that is more important than just the standard, because until you give back to the community which you have taken to build that data center, this is never going to be, the standards are never going to improve. And with the scale, we get that knowledge, where we can contribute back. And that's why the whole open source project on our data center is super critical for us, because that gives us the insight on how to do things better. And also a competitive edge compared to anybody else, because we not only adhere to the lot of standard what industry or what government wants us to follow, we also open source and say these are the other standards we are following to make sure that every customer is safe and secure with us. So I think standard has to look into two different paradigms. One is, how can we make it better, and how can we use this as a differentiating point from the industry?
Thank you. Would you like to finish off for us, Hiroshi?
Thank you. Yes. When you develop a standard, then you're done. So your job is finished. But ITU also promotes their work in using for example, trade show, exhibitions, or sometimes academic conference to present latest standards developed by ITU, so that the people know there is a standard. And if the developed standards is not known by anyone, it's useless. So we try to promote the product of ITU in a wider public, in addition to the regular participants. And in terms of academia, there are quite a few academia members participating in ITU's development of standards, and we are aware that the papers and standards are not counted in the same way. So the ITU is thinking about how they can give some more intensive to the academia members. So I think it's a good discussion point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed, Mr. Pradeep Junjavala, Mr. Jacques Flouet, Professor Simon Pietro Romano, and Mr. Hiroshi Ota, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sorry I've called you by first name sometimes, by second name sometimes, by the wrong name sometimes, but it's been an absolute privilege to share this session with you. I've learned masses. So thank you very, very much. What I'm really grateful for is that it's Mr. Kamal Kishori who has to sum up, and he's now got about 2 minutes to do it. So I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll hand over to Kamal.
Thank you, Emma. You've been a great moderator. Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you, Emma, very much. And to all the panelists, this was a fascinating discussion. I am not from the world of digital infrastructure and data centers. So, I was lapping up every single word that was spoken. Many things that resonated with my world, which is the world of architecture and urban planning. So it was interesting to see parallels. It is a very difficult task to summarize this rich conversation, but I will make a very feeble attempt at it. I think there were two big top line messages which we must go home with. there were 4 challenges and 4 solutions. The 2 top line messages were, one phrase which I really picked up was integrated climate and disaster resilience. We cannot look at data centers in isolation. They are connected with utilities, applications, networks, and so on. So we really have to think about how we work towards integrated climate and disaster resilience. And in the last 15, the second big takeaway message is the discussion that has happened in the last 15 minutes or so on the core of this webinar, which is the role of standards. So earlier in this talk, there was a quotable quote: standards are tools, they're not rules. And there's so many standards, but we need to evangelize about them, make people accept them. There should be a business case for them. The classic tussle between performance-based versus prescriptive standards. How do we make sure that they get the uptake is high? And of course, the whole thing that it's standards are by industry and for industry. There is one point which came up in this discussion was how customers really need to buy into it. Just by having standards themselves is not enough. So I think these were the 2 big ticket sort of takeaways. One was on integrated climate and disaster resilience, and this whole rich discussion on standards. Now, some of the challenges, I think the 4 big challenges were the whole challenge of how do we contend with the scale at which the data centers are growing, scale, speed, agility. How do we contend with local regulation in that? So that was one. The second was how do we ensure that there is how do we ensure that in a new paradigm, when data centers are not just in single specific locations, but are in multiple locations, that changes the dynamics of what it would take to build resilience. And then in terms of some of the solutions early on in the discussion was, how do we have better analytics inform this whole work? How do we revise the return periods that we designed for? How do we do fresh assessments for site locations? So that whole one lump of issue of analytics, how do we mobilize the best analytics to inform the development and management of data centers? And then there was the issue of defining what is the resilience, what level of resilience data centers require, coming up with a resilience matrix. Resilient matrix is something which came up a couple of times early in the discussion. Then in terms of solution, there was another thing talking about the role of redundancy. There was this quotable quote, moving from risk avoidance to risk mitigation. Within the context of redundancy, the whole notion of digital twins, remote operations, automations, all of these things facilitate resilience, but also impose new challenges. We need to know about these things remotely with a lot more in a lot more detail. There was one segment where there was a lot of discussion on the dialogue between public and private players, different organizations. Mr. Ota very eloquently talked about that you shouldn't be just sending letters, but actually interacting with various parts of the industry to sort of come up with joined up solutions. And I was also quite struck by the innovative work, the solution in terms of innovative experiments, such as this data center 30 days from factory to power up. So we discussed numerous challenges, numerous approaches to addressing those challenges. And it has been an immensely rich and intense an hour and 45 minutes. I hope I have tried, I hope you can see my sincerity in trying to do a reasonable job of summarizing what was a fabulous, extremely rich, productive, and very, very stimulating discussion. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, I can assure you that this is not the last. This is the beginning of this dialogue. We'll carry this forward in specific ways. And more importantly, we will turn some of the ideas that have come into play today into our programming and actually support countries, where the establishment of new data centers or existing data centers is contending with disaster and climate risk related challenges. We would like to provide support, facilitate processes that help us address those challenges. With that, before I close, it is my duty to, a pleasant duty to also acknowledge colleagues who made time. I can see them on the screen: Emma, Mr. Ota, Mr. Flue, Mr. Simon, Pietro Romano, Mr. Pradeep, Navid for participating in this, our colleague from MIT, and also my team here at CDRI, led by Neha Bhatia, who has curated this alongside Rajat Uchil, Pranjal, Gyanesh, Ravi, Payal, Santosh, Mona, Samir, and Wasi. There are many, to curate a good webinar requires a lot of background work in terms of reaching out to people, having a good communication plan, making sure that the technology works and everything. And it has been a tremendous team effort, which shall continue from here on. With that, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you
Thanks a
very
lot.
much.
Have a nice rest of
Thank
your
you.
day.